Hey guys, Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist here in Warsaw, Poland, and here today to talk about EU bank accounts specifically. Should you have one? What are the pros and what are the cons of banking in the European Union? A lot of people, specifically from the US, when they come to me, mention things or at least ask about the European Union. Some folks are pretty adamant about wanting their second passport to be from the EU. They want their bank account to be from the EU. And I tend to think a lot of people maybe misunderstand some of the benefits and downsides of being involved with the European Union, or at least overstate the benefits. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, ask your doctor about such and such medication. Then people go in asking about the medication, and they don't really know what it's about. I think that a lot of people look at the EU as a great place to bank, even though it may not suit their needs. So let's go through the pros and the cons. The number one pro that I see for investors and entrepreneurs, and that's what I am, is the legitimacy that banking in the EU or another developed country can bring. Specifically, I have known a few people who have banked in these fly-speck islands in the Caribbean, Belize, etc., that they found, many of them on internet forums that were based around fast, easy, and cheap, rather than getting the job done right. And everything went very well and was very easy and was very cheap and fast and all that until they had to move $250,000 out. And one case, it took 5 months to move the money out into the quote-unquote first world jurisdiction where this guy wanted it to go because the receiving bank had a lot of questions. I think in one case the fly-speck island bank had a lot of problems as well. So when you're in the EU, when you're in a first world quote-unquote jurisdiction, whether we like it or not, other quote-unquote first-world jurisdictions tend to trust those countries. If you're planning on moving money around, whether it's from your own offshore company to yourself for a salary, etc., money from an EU bank has a bit of that more of air of legitimacy. Things are going to be faster, right? Especially if you're transferring money in the within the EU. Benefit number two would be fast transfers, and within the EU, generally free or very cheap transfers. The second benefit would be the ability to hold currencies. Especially if you're buying euros or any other European currency right now from US dollars, you can get very good rates, much better than even a month or two ago. So if you're looking to just kind of hold a foreign currency and diversify into a foreign currency, an EU bank account allows you to do that. Now, it's not a total pro because there are plenty of other countries around the world that allow you to hold euros, whether it is other countries in Europe that aren't in the EU, or as far as Mongolia, they allow you to hold euros. Now, if you're looking to hold Polish zloty, as in they have here in Poland, Czech crowns, Hungarian forint, why, I don't know, but okay. If you want to hold those other currencies, then obviously banking in that country is going to make it a lot easier. Norwegian crowns, for example. So that's something to do if you want to hold those currencies as a diversification tool. Also, it's not so much a pro, but it's more of a requirement. Certain peer-to-peer lending services, crowdfunding, crowd real estate, crowd equity, etc., such as like Twino, for example, the P2P lending platform people have asked me about. They require, in some cases, EU residents, but in other cases, they just require an EU bank account. So if you want to lend money on Twino or on other services like that, they want you to have an EU bank account the same way the services of the same feather in the U.S. want you to have a U.S. bank account. So in some cases, it may be a requirement to have an EU account. Obviously, deposit insurance is a pro. People look at that. 100,000 euros in deposit insurance is required. Perhaps they're fearful of banks in Mongolia going under, and who knows what will happen. And lastly, if you're looking to do deals in a country, i.e. I'm here in Poland and I'm going to start doing some real estate deals, it's good just to put the money in the bank account. You have a place where you can send and receive money. If you own rental property, it's a lot easier to receive rents, unless you have a property manager holding cash for you. It's a lot easier to receive rents in the country with your local bank account. Or if you're doing property deals and you want to put the money, in my case, I want to buy into this zloty at what's a reasonably low rate historically, and lock that rate in for my deals. So those are the pros on banking in the European Union. But there are some cons, and I think that one of the things, in a lot of people who come to me's situation, is that they just think of the EU the same way that prescription medications advertise on television. Ask your doctor about such and such medication. And people go to their doctor and ask about it. They don't know why they need it, but they kind of think it sounds good. And so the reality is that the EU isn't really such a great diversification tool when you consider that the banks there are not just as bad as they are in the US or other developed countries. You're not really getting the full diversification that I would like to see you have, in that if you're a US citizen, going and banking another sinking ship economy may not be the answer. I have yet to find, for example, a Greek bank that I like, or an Italian bank that I like. So a lot of the countries in the EU that have local banks around Europe just aren't that good. On top of that, the deposit insurance that people rave about, of course we saw in Cyprus how that was kind of tossed out the window. The government, if things get bad enough, can certainly get rid of deposit insurance. So the idea that we should rely on that in lieu of finding a healthy bank, I think, is mistaken. And quite frankly, I think you can find healthier banks outside of the European Union in many cases. As to holding currency, I don't see that as a good enough benefit necessarily to bank in the European Union, especially when you see some banks, or really some countries, having problems, i.e. Latvia. Latvia has been cracked down on by the U.S. government for a while now for all the Russians who are banking there, and as a result, it's become kind of a challenge to bank there. And it's not worth, in my opinion, the ability to hold euros in that account when you can hold euros somewhere else in a place that's not under the magnifying glass. Obviously, there are a lot of forms, there's a lot of requirements, especially if you're a U.S. citizen with EU banks. Potentially there is taxation, although that's generally taken care of on any interest. Generally, they just withhold that and pay it, but something that you have to think about in European Union countries that are very high tax and have lots of bureaucracy and regulations. And on top of that, the places that you might think you want to bank, i.e. Western Europe, are generally very difficult. For example, Ireland came out recently and said if you have a company and you don't actually have operations in Ireland, you can't bank here. So the idea of having a company elsewhere in the EU and then banking in Ireland no longer works. Even having an Irish company and banking in Ireland, if your office isn't there, does not work. So what you look at is the banks in the European Union that are accessible are more in Central and Eastern Europe, and some of them may be okay, but in general these banks are the countries that have their own currency, which means that the spreads on transferring your dollars or euros in can be 3 or 4%. It can be very expensive to move large sums of money in. So the bureaucracy of the EU, the fact that the deposit insurance doesn't necessarily mean anything, the fact that some of the countries in the EU have had some problems, many of the banks are undercapitalized, great bureaucracy, and nominal benefits, I don't necessarily see as a good idea for the average person. Unless you're doing business in one of these countries and you want to be in that currency and you want to be able to send and receive money, I don't see it as a huge benefit necessarily. I think that the best thing for the average person who's a location-independent entrepreneur or investor to do is to have potentially a small transactional bank account in the EU, although even that I think could be easily replicated somewhere else. But in terms of large wealth storage, I don't think that the EU is necessarily a great place to bank. Now, one of the examples for people who want to store large sums of money, we've talked in the past about Norway, which is not part of the EU, but perhaps has the same implied benefits people ask about. Norway is something to consider if you have large sums of money, but for the average person looking for a transactional bank account, that's about as far as I would take it. Large bank accounts with lots of money, I'd much rather put in wealth havens, and quite frankly, I don't see a lot of wealth havens right now in the European Union. So banking in the EU, probably not worth it for the average person, at least on a medium to large scale.